everyone, welcome to All Things Iceland. It's Jules, and today I'm going to be sharing 5 things that confuse Icelanders about US culture. And for those who are not aware, I am from the US, born and raised in Brooklyn, and it's been really fascinating living here for over 6 years, hearing different things that people talk about, and just kind of getting more cultural insight that I love sharing with all of you. One thing to note is that when I say confuse Icelanders, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't get it at all, but it's more of like a head scratcher or just kind of questioning, why is this specific thing in the culture that way? So I just thought I'd make that clarification because obviously it can be that logically people are just trying to understand it, and in other times it's just like, what is happening? And there is legitimate confusion. So on that note, let's just get into it. The first one is kind of my favorite, and one that can definitely be applied to other cultures than just the US, and it has to do with the fact that Icelanders often get confused by the fact that we call our relatives more than cousins. So for instance, having like aunt, uncle, cousins, those things get really confusing to Icelanders when you talk to them about, say, for instance, we're having a conversation and they're like, oh yeah, my mother's brother. And you'd be like, oh, your uncle. And they're like, yeah, sure, or frænti. So there is this word, frænti or frænka, which means cousin, or kind of like, it just means family member, honestly, in Icelandic. And this is used for like the groupings when it comes to like aunts, uncles, cousins. Of course, there are names for like your grandmother, like amma or ave. But once it gets to this part where it's extended family in this particular way, it is confusing to Icelanders when you talk to them and they say something like that. And you're like, oh yeah, that's your cousin. They're like, right, yeah, okay. It's just not part of how they think about it. And I find that pretty interesting. Number 2 has to do with politics, and particularly the political system and how it's set up in the United States. So funny enough, Iceland and the US have some similarities. So in Iceland, there are 3 branches of government: the executive branch that's headed by the president, who's head of state. You have the legislative branch, which is Alþingi or parliament. And then you also, of course, have the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court. That's kind of where it stops, mainly because a lot of Icelanders scratch their heads, in essence, when they hear about the fact that in the US, there are just 2 political parties. And not to say that there are only 2 political parties on every level of government, but we're talking on the federal level. And historically, how things have been is Democrat and Republican is what you have to choose from in the United States. In Iceland, there are multiple parties, even new parties that have been formed and that have been able to get into parliament because of the fact that this 2-party system, like they're not locked into this 2-party system. It's not to say there aren't political parties in Iceland that have a huge following or have been around for a long time and all that jazz. There are definitely those. But I find it really interesting, and also many Icelanders, and thinking about the fact that you're locked into that. And as I live here and I kind of see how things play out, granted, parliament in Iceland is not perfect, but I do find it refreshing and kind of interesting to know that different parties can come up and be in parliament. And even sometimes the names of the parties can be quite different. For instance, as a random example, the Pirate Party in Iceland is a thing, and they're going strong. Number 3 is the need to put up signs and ropes in places where it is obviously dangerous. So this is something that happens a lot in the US, and it's been happening in Iceland because of a lot more tourists, people unfortunately being risky with behavior. Even if there is a sign, the fact that sometimes now there's even like flashing lights at Reynisfjara Black Sand Beach, or ropes in places where when there weren't tourists in Iceland, this was not something that was there because people were like, oh yeah, that cliff is dangerous, don't go too close. Or we shouldn't, be too close to these waves, things of that nature. So that does sometimes confuse Icelanders because it's just like, why would you take that risk? Not to say there's never been Icelanders who have done silly or stupid things, but at the same time, they're, I guess, growing up here and having an understanding about the nature, there's confusion as to why they have to go so far as to almost feel like it's Disneyfying, you know, places. It's like overdoing it on the caution aspect, which can sometimes take away the view of the nature, but you know, at this point it's better safe than sorry, since tourism is such a huge part of the country and the economy. Also, people really just want you to be safe. Number 4 is when Icelanders see how much gun violence there is in the United States and wonder why there are not stricter gun regulations. And this topic I actually did a video on, I think it was maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, and there will be a link to it in the description box, about how Iceland at the time had 67,000 guns registered in the country and hardly any gun violence. There have been some incidences over the years that I've been living here regarding guns, but they are fairly rare. And I think it's really interesting to me when you break down why is that the case. So first of all, just culture-wise, in Iceland, the idea of owning a gun is meant to be for sport and hunting, not for protecting yourself. That's at least not how it has been viewed by people majority-wise that live here. For you to get a gun, there is a layered process. We're talking tests, classes, the ability to show that you know how to store the gun properly so it's in a locked cabinet, all of these things that you have to go through in order to be considered a responsible owner of a gun. And I go through what that whole process is like in Iceland in that video, so definitely check it out. Link is in the description. So of course, me knowing that about Iceland and hearing Icelanders, once they're reading news, because of course they get world news about mass shootings and things of this nature, it is very confusing that there is not more gun regulation in the United States. I think it's also helpful to know that there's over 360,000 people that live in Iceland. So yes, it is small, but the amount of guns compared to the amount of people, you would think that potentially there would be more gun violence. But as I mentioned, there are factors that go into place, and then of course seeing from this environment and kind of growing up with this idea about guns and what they're used for, it makes Icelanders kind of confused, kind of scratch their heads as to what's the problem with gun regulation and just making sure that they don't get into the wrong hands. Number 5 has to do with tipping and the fact that there are so many people in the United States who a tip for them is how they make their living. So this is really foreign and confusing sometimes for Icelanders when they go to the United States and maybe you're at a diner and you're understanding or have heard that the people who are the wait staff there, for instance, don't get paid a livable wage, so they rely on tips. And in Iceland, tipping is something that is not encouraged because people are being paid livable wages. If you were to decide to tip, like for instance, people do this with their guides, whatever, that's totally up to you, but it isn't something that's expected or, like I mentioned, encouraged to do. So it can be weird to go to another place where the culture around it is basically like you're at the discretion of a customer as to whether or not you could make a livable wage. And I remember talking to an Icelander about this because there's the standard rate of like 10 or 15%. But in essence, they're hoping for more because obviously the more the better in order for them to be able to afford their bills. So those are some of the observations that I've made regarding things about US culture that confuse Icelanders. I'd love to hear if any of them surprised you. Let me know in the comments below, as well as if there are any Icelanders out there, because I know there are some that subscribe to my channel who have lived in the US or have at least been exposed to like US culture from visiting and things like that. Definitely let me know if there are others that surprised you or, you know, continue to surprise you, whether you live there or, like I mentioned, have visited. If you've enjoyed this video, definitely make sure to give it a thumbs up and to share it with someone who you think would find it interesting. Also, if you enjoy content like this, I have loads of other amazing videos coming up regarding Icelandic history, culture, language, nature, and travel. So make sure that you subscribe and you hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.